I should be good. So I'll quickly introduce myself, go by my pseudonym Prometheus. I have been with the ecosystem for quite a long time. I started in 2017 with the Maker Foundation, which is the organization that launched the multilateral DAI protocol. Today, you may know them as Sky. 2021, the Maker Foundation actually dissolved, and Maker did a radical decentralization experiment, which got me interested in decentralized organizations and how to scale them up, which we will get to. And then from 2023, I started working specifically on Powerhouse, and I founded Powerhouse as a solution to the issues that we saw with scaling decentralized organizations at Maker. So this is maybe something that I don't need to convince everyone of. Maybe you already know this, but centralization makes big tech quite harmful. The products that are being built by the big tech companies, they're mostly like the equivalents of cigarettes or unhealthy food, like sugars. People are really addicted to them. Despite the harmful effects they have, they continue to use the product. But if there were a better way, a more healthy way, then we could offer better products for these people to work with. And centralization is a problem I will try to convince you about. So we all know this is just what we kind of grew to accept these days. So first of all, social media is incredibly divisive. It's really a poison that everyone is just consuming. There are very extreme examples of that. For example, there's a well-documented case of Facebook, which using the same engagement maximizing algorithms that it always does, for example, had a big role that it played in the actual genocide that happened in Myanmar. This is an extreme example, but of course we see this every day on Twitter, on Facebook, everywhere, that these social media platforms are extremely divisive. They prioritize clickbait, rage bait, and they're just quite bad products in that regard, and they lead to very negative outcomes. The other thing is that this kind of rent-seeking model where people are locked into the platform and the product, so they're made addicted to it. And then after that, once everyone is kind of locked in and has that addiction to the product, then these organizations, they turn to rent-seeking. They start to extract undue value from the products that they've made everyone dependent on. And this is just the business model of centralized VCs and centralized platforms. This is well known. So, for example, a couple of years ago, there was a high-profile takeover or acquisition by Broadcom of the VMware product. Now, VMware was built as a centralized product, pretty traditional, that was playing quite nicely in the market, and so has really built a large user base with a good product that they offered with licensing options that were attractive and so on, good value for the pricing. But when Broadcom acquired VMware, they did the thing that will ultimately happen with centralized platforms and products, which is that they used that quasi-monopoly that they had to drastically increase prices. So for VMware users, this meant that especially the small users, they could see now a multiple of the cost that they had before, and they were all locked into these products, and so this was incredibly harmful. There's a very famous example of a Dutch government agency actually that faced an 85% cost increase on their VMware licenses, just because they were locked into this product. There was vendor lock-in, and Broadcom did what these corporations do, and they introduced these price hikes to cash in on the dependency that they had created. Big tech also undermines democracy and the sovereignty of nations these days. So it often happens that critical institutions completely depend on these centralized providers, and sooner or later, sometimes they do play nice for a long time, but sooner or later, they will use that dependency relationship to start extracting undue value. So there was a interesting example also with the changing political climate and the kind of global political environment, where more and more these players are not playing nicely anymore, and they are starting to actually use the leverage they have to to exploit their users essentially. There was a very interesting example of the International Criminal Court, in The Hague, where prosecutors, because they were involved in certain lawsuits that weren't to the that the U.S. Powerbase didn't like, they just used their leverage at Microsoft to, for example, block the email addresses and just block operations at the international court. So this is a typical example. There are many more. So another one would be the NHS in the UK, which was milked by Oracle, for example, once they were completely locked in and dependent on the single vendor. So these centralized products and platforms are really problematic, and centralization is the issue. The reason why these companies are behaving the way they do is because the shareholders and the key decision makers, they are isolated from the negative effects that they are creating. If Oracle is harming the NHS, if Facebook is creating hate speech to the point where a genocide occurs, if all these things happen, of course, the executives and the shareholders, the stakeholders of these companies, they are not affected. And so there is a fundamental incentive disalignment that leads to these negative outcomes. And in a way, they have to, because corporations do have the fiduciary duty to just prioritize the profits for their shareholders. So if they weren't extractive, and if they wouldn't apply these techniques, they wouldn't actually be following their responsibilities. And so this is why sustainable open source and open builder networks are a solution for this. It's because we remove this incentive disalignment where you have a small group of people making all the decisions while they are actually isolated from the negative impacts of the decisions that they're making. So there are some signs of hope that the world is kind of catching up with this reality and that changes are coming. So I'll give a couple of examples here. I think OpenStack is a very good example of this. So I talked already about VMware that was acquired by Broadcom, and which essentially started an extortion racket against its own customers. Well, this actually has led to the dominant open source alternative, which is OpenStack, which is a replacement for VMware, but interestingly enough, also for centralized AWS, for example, Amazon Web Services. And OpenStack saw a lot of renewed interest when VMware was being captured and they were starting to extract that value from the market. At that moment, the software that was already there, which was created actually by NASA in the originally, because they didn't want to be dependent on US commercial players themselves. And so the software was in a state where it was kind of an alternative to VMware and AWS and decentralized players, but it wasn't quite there yet in the polishing and the offering in the market. Now, what the VMware situation created is that a lot of these smaller players, they did the additional effort that was required to turn OpenStack into a real open source alternative for VMware and for AWS. So now you actually have like a large number of service providers that you can buy from, get the same kind of service that you would be getting from VMware, from AWS, but you are not locked into a single vendor. And they can do this thanks to the open source and the open standards that are embedded in the OpenStack software. So this is a very nice example of centralized greed and extortion that leads to a breaking point where an open source alternative then gets the opportunity to break through. As the world is changing and world politics is changing, um, governments are also starting to become more and more aware that it is a real risk and they cannot afford actually to depend on centralized US big tech players. And there are numerous examples of this, and almost every week you can read about new examples. There are just a few here. So, very recently, Denmark decided, following countries like France, Germany, that they need to drastically reduce their dependence on Microsoft. So, what they are doing is they are switching to open source alternatives because it becomes like a reality and a requirement in the new political theater. So they are adopting either Linux and typically also LibreOffice as alternatives to Microsoft because of security concerns, because they can no longer afford to be dependent on these centralized players. And they do see open source as the alternative and the way out of this. Brazil is another example where the federal government at one point recognized that the critical dependency on US technology was a strategic risk and an issue that needed to be addressed. And so they voted into a law, a number of rules that assert that like the government and the critical functions of government will over time migrate away and be no longer dependent on these centralized players and instead choose for open source alternatives. There are many other examples. This Kenya recently, India made similar decisions. In Ukraine, this is even more so the case with the conflict with Russia, which unfolded in multiple stages. When Russia actually took Crimea like years ago, that was like the first alarm sign, the alarm bells that the dependence on centralized software by the Ukrainian government and its military was a big issue because they couldn't fix the problems that they were seeing when they were facing digital warfare and hacking and so on, and interference from Russia. So what they did is they started switching to open source software. And today, Ukraine is actually a beautiful example of a government and a defense system that runs a lot on open source software to avoid these pitfalls that centralized technologies bring with them. So these are very real and practical examples of open source gaining terrain because countries and governments are starting to understand that the centralized dependency is a real issue. And last but not least, of course, what we are doing here, Ethereum, DeFi, DAOs, this is another piece of the puzzle that is really needed to make sure that we can shift the world more from centralized technologies to decentralized, functional, and competitive organizations. I won't talk a lot about this. I think you are well familiar with these topics. So how can we break this spell? So how can we actually push things to a tipping point where this open source wave turns into a tsunami that can really take territory from the centralized players? We're actually pretty well positioned at the moment because the situation is there to make some real progress here. Now, the one concept that I would like you to take away today maybe is the idea of the open source software replacement window. This is the idea that when you have centralized technology, once it becomes more critical, once it gets more dependent users, after a while, when that relationship starts to turn sour, open source alternatives will emerge. But it's just that it takes a long time before that is the case. And so maybe you can guess what the strategy should be to make sure that we can be a little bit more, have better foresight and like act earlier and prevent the dependency in the first place rather than trying to fix the problem once it's already established. So again, centralized rent seeking, it requires open source alternatives to lag. So they rely on the fact that open source is running behind the curve, and they need to run or they need to lag sufficiently for the centralized players to make enough profits once they start to extract value from the market. This is how it works. It's just the VC's business model. So first, what will happen is the VCs will back with infinite amounts of money a new product, and then just keep pumping money into it so that they can capture all the market share. So they build up a monopoly, they make their users dependent, and they eradicate all the meaningful competition. And so this is actually quite bad in terms of market economics, because this creates very inefficient markets. Now you have a single player that controls the market, and now the single player can, of course, with all these dependent users, start charging any price they want or making any changes they want to extract value from this. So they essentially start with the exploitation of that captured market. They will start turning on the screws, they will start tightening the screws and increasing licensing prices, exerting control that maybe they didn't exert before. All the examples that I gave, these are examples of after a period of playing nice, they turn extractive because they know that their users are dependent on them. And so this continues until open source alternatives become available. This is very clear, for example, with Oracle, as I mentioned, they use the dependent relationship of, for example, the NHS in the UK, where they started to kind of squeeze the system. And this led ultimately to the emergence of open source databases, which are today a very good alternative to Oracle proprietary databases. And so they kind of avoid that vendor lock-in. So really what we need to do is we just need to reduce this window, and we need to make sure that the open source alternatives start to become available on the market sooner, before they can actually extract enough value to give the high return on investment of their centralized investors. Because that really, it breaks their business model. And actually, if you think about it, that's not that difficult to do. We just need to start building sooner, and that's it. So if we can reduce this replacement window, the time that it takes for open source software to replace the centralized competitors, then the rent-seeking phase is no longer profitable. So these VCs have pouring all this money into the project, but now they don't see their returns, because by the time they start extracting value, the open source alternative is already there. And so what you will see, interestingly enough, is a reversion of the tragedy of the commons, because now this so-called rational capital, it will defect towards the decentralized solutions, because they know that the centralized solution becomes just a subsidy that they are putting in the system, which will not give them the return on investment that they require. So really the only thing we need to do is reduce that OSS replacement window to just break this business model that is fueling decentralized players. And there is more good news, because the tipping point is actually nearer than you may think. It may seem that everyone today is hopelessly dependent on all these centralized vendors, but this is actually not the case. There are a number of things that start moving now, which give us an incredible opportunity to make real progress here. And so I have listed them here. So there are 4 converging trends, which I think create a wonderful opportunity to push back against kind of the centralized monopolies that we're seeing. So the first point is what I already mentioned when I talked about OpenStack. There are actually already a lot of open source alternatives available, but they're not at the same level. They can't compete today with the centralized solutions. But the baseline open source software is actually already there, and often also funded by the same companies as they were battling each other. Because, for example, Google made a lot of contributions to the open source ecosystem with Chrome and all the software they released in their competitive battles with Apple and Microsoft. So the software is largely already there, and actually the gap is smaller than you may think. But we do need to cover that gap and make the software competitive with the centralized alternatives. The second point is what I already mentioned, is that with the recent changes in world politics and the way that countries behave with each other, the more transaction-based relationships that we're kind of falling back to, sovereignty is again on the agenda, and it is indeed very high on the agenda. So governments and large organizations that are looking to become independent from US politics are actually really pushing now for open source solutions and looking at open source solutions as a security uh, pro, implementation that they really need. The third point is the development in AI. AI makes it a lot cheaper now and is continuing to make it a lot cheaper to produce additional software. So this gap that we need to cover is becoming a lot cheaper to cover today thanks to AI. So we need to use AI to make sure that we can put all the missing pieces in place to make these open source alternatives competitive with decentralized players in the market. Once we have these, and they are largely already in place, we need one more thing. We need to organize open source builders, and we need to deliver competitive end user solutions with open source builder networks that can compete with, for example, the Amazons and the Microsofts of the world. So this may seem like a very difficult task because can you imagine a DAO, which is the closest equivalent we have to these open source builder networks? Can you imagine a DAO coming together and offering a service that is as good as Amazon Web Services, Airbnb, Uber, you name it? Well, today that's almost laughable because we all know that DAOs in their first generation, they weren't scalable. And so, but this is exactly the problem that Powerhouse has been looking at since a couple of years. And I only have 20 minutes for the presentation, so I don't have time enough to dig into exactly how we do everything. But so we need to, the role of Powerhouse essentially is to organize open source builders and to make sure that they can come together to build these competitive end user solutions to the centralized products that people are dependent on. And so again, I won't go into much detail right now, but if you're interested, you can definitely talk to us. So we currently have 2 platforms that we are building, which should help and should solve this problem of scaling up DAOs, bringing builders together and coordinate them to produce these competitive products. So we have our Acro platform, which is a decentralized operation platform for scalable network organizations. Scalable network organizations is the model that we have in mind that can replace DAOs and make them better, fix the critical issues that they have so that they can compete with these centralized players. This is an operational platform. It is software. It is also the legal side of things because very often what is missing is the legal machinery to take investments, to make sure that you can have an official relationship with your users and provide good quality user service and so on. So these are all the problems that we're looking at with the Acro platform. And if you're interested, then definitely come talk to us. The second platform is actually more on the software and the infrastructure level. So as I talked about before, OpenStack was a real game changer in that it made it possible to become independent from players like AWS that otherwise seem to be really dominant and like pointless to fight. Vetra is our second platform, which is a sovereign infrastructure for scalable network organization that builds local first, but built to scale. So what that means is we combine the best from blockchain technology, but also from distributed networks, rapid application development, all the things you need to really build a platform that can help open source builders to organize in a way that they are fully independent from any of these centralized players in the market. And so as you may well know, like blockchain technology is a very important element in that. But in today's, the status today is that it is not sufficient. And what Vetra offers is a framework on top of that to make it really possible to take the best of all these new technologies and combine them into truly sovereign platforms and independent platforms that are not dependent on the centralized players. So that was it. Thanks for listening. You can find me on the evil social media there. And yeah, do not panic, organize. Thank you.